Hello friends, welcome to the Windmill. My name is Windstorm64, and today I want to talk about one of my favorite underrated racing game franchises, F-Zero. You know, the other game with Captain Falcon? Yeah, if you don't know, F-Zero is a racing game series originally created by Nintendo for the SNES. I was completely unaware of this game until I was like 12, 13, and I didn't play it until I was much older and bought it used well after its time. I was actually introduced to the series when I got Super Smash Bros. For N64. As many know, Captain Falcon was a playable character. In Smash, you could actually find a list containing short descriptions or stories about the characters, as well as which games they came from. This list basically introduced 3 new game series to me: Metroid, Earthbound, and of course, F-Zero. I remember browsing the local video rental place a few days after playing Smash, looking for an N64 game to play, and that day a particular game caught my eye. That game was F-Zero X. The interesting thing about this particular rental was that it came with the game's original instruction manual. Now I know this all sounds a bit unusual, but this was a locally owned and ran rental place back in the 90s. They didn't have much as far as video games, mostly VHS tapes and DVDs for a little while, but they did have N64 games. And back then they just had the cartridges in a clear plastic case sitting on the shelf. It was very rare for one of their games to actually come with an instruction manual. Now, I'll admit I was still a kid at the time, and before that time, I distinctly remember I didn't give 2 shits about instruction manuals, like most kids. However, on the way home from the store, I decided to read some of the manual for F-Zero X, and before I realized it, I'd read the whole damn thing. It was strange when I think about it now, but just through that instruction booklet and its almost comic book aesthetic, I became very immersed in that world. The game itself shares this comic book-esque art style, but it has no story to speak of. It's just a futuristic racing game, plain and simple. The manual more or less just builds up this cool backstory around it, and while the gameplay is great, I really expected the game to have something of a story to it, so that was a little disappointing. F-Zero X is still my personal favorite in the series though. The game has very smooth gameplay and intuitive controls. It was a hard-ass game, but cool as shit and genuinely a lot of fun. F-Zero GX for the Nintendo GameCube would come out next, and I consider that to be at least a decent entry in the series. I personally think the story mode was an interesting idea, but I don't think it was really executed properly, and I'll talk about that a bit more later. As far as the gameplay is concerned though, it was more or less identical to the N64 title. The graphics overhaul can be a bit distracting, but still cool, and you get used to it. Now I do know there are a couple of GBA games out there in the series, but I never played those. After that, the F-Zero series just disappeared, and the series is basically dead these days. Its last major entry being the game I just talked about, F-Zero GX, a game which was released in 2003. Okay, I'm just now realizing it, but that means that we haven't seen a new F-Zero game for 2 whole decades. 20 years. That's absolutely insane. Now to clarify, when I say the series is underrated, I'm not necessarily talking about the players. In fact, most of what I've heard online has been pretty positive in regards to these games. I would instead suggest that the series is underrated by Nintendo themselves. Now I'm not narrow-minded, so I can understand this sentiment from a business perspective. F-Zero X didn't do great, neither did F-Zero GX. The only other F-Zero games out there are the original for the SNES, which I own, and the GBA games, which I simply don't play. I tried out one of them, and while I liked it because it had more story, it just felt like the SNES game, just with a worse frame rate. Taking all this into account, it makes perfect sense to me that Nintendo would simply stop making F-Zero games and focus on their more profitable franchises like Mario Kart, a franchise which has consistently outsold F-Zero, and by extension is also much more popular, and for good reason. It starts out with a huge advantage right out the gate since it's Mario related, but it also has a ton of features that set it apart from most other racing games. The most obvious being the battle racing format, where you have weapons and other power-ups to enhance the experience. On top of that, Mario Kart has no plot or backstory. It's just a racing game with all the charm and fun of a Mario game. F-Zero, on the other hand, is almost the exact opposite. It's a bit more fleshed out with its somewhat dark story about a dystopian future where a dangerous and previously illegal race is essentially legalized by the wealthy and powerful exclusively for profit. It has a surprisingly detailed lore and history. Every single character has a backstory. Many of the tracks are set on different planets, which seem to have their own history. Unfortunately, F-Zero games more or less ignore this rich universe that exists around them. GX tried to flesh out the world a bit, but it's done through a very short, very linear story featuring F-Zero's main character and Smash Bros. Veteran, Captain Falcon. This is frankly a little disappointing. I find the F-Zero universe to be incredibly intriguing, just begging for expansion and exploration. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that if Nintendo did release a new F-Zero game, I'd like to see something less akin to the classic F-Zero format and something more like Need for Speed Most Wanted. I mean, imagine for just a moment a game where you get to just drive around in an F-Zero machine, explore the worlds, meet characters, do side missions, purchase upgrades, and of course take part in races. For me, that sounds amazing. I can't say that a game like this would sell well, but I see plenty of untapped potential there. If it were done well enough, I think it could give F-Zero a new life. Adding this free-roaming, open-world style gameplay would not only set it apart from the F-Zero games of the past, it would give people a reason to play it over other racing games like Mario Kart. That, in my humble opinion, is the biggest problem with F-Zero games. I mean, despite being these cool, futuristic sci-fi racing games, they are almost bare bones in comparison to other games in the genre. All you really do is race. There's no power-ups or battle modes like Mario Kart. There is little to no story in the games. In fact, most of the lore comes from the instruction manuals and character bios. Even GX, which lets you create your own machines, and had a story mode, felt very limited. Despite this, I really miss the F-Zero games. I know I'm in the minority here, but I also know that I'm not alone. Furthermore, considering the capabilities of the Switch, I think the time is just about right for a new F-Zero game. It should be optional, of course, but I think the Switch's motion controls would be perfect fit for this game, and that's saying a lot, considering that I am not the biggest fan of motion controls. One thing that gives me hope for F-Zero's future is that it is now available on the Switch. It's wishful thinking, of course, but seeing a new generation of F-Zero fans could be just what Nintendo needs in order for them to reconsider their stance on making new F-Zero games. I was obsessed with these games as a kid, and even as an adult, a big part of that obsession still remains. As a result, I maintain hope that one day we will see the series finally make a comeback. I'll be honest though, my cynical nature is telling me it's just not gonna happen, and the closest we'll ever get to a new F-Zero is Mario Kart 8. When I first saw the F-Zero stuff in that game, I was like, hey, that's cool, but eventually it just made me kinda sad. It felt like a tease, because it was a fleeting glimpse into the potential that a new F-Zero game could have. It's unfortunate that F-Zero has become so irrelevant that Captain Falcon is known more for being in Smash Bros. Than his own games. I think in order for a new F-Zero game to succeed, it would have to be a departure from just a pure racing game. It needs to expand on and explore its unique and interesting worlds. It can still focus itself around racing, of course, but it needs to bring something more to the genre, something that you can't usually get from racing games. One way or the other, I think I've rambled on long enough. What are your feelings about F-Zero games? If you have any ideas for how to make an F-Zero game work in the modern era, feel free to let me know. Anyway, thank you everyone so much for watching. As always, take it easy, and I will see you next time.